The championship final. 8 women. Adjacent lanes. Cassian Vale stands directly to her left, close enough that Reyna feels the stillness radiating off her, that terrifying composure, that 4-year problem. The starter raises the command. Reyna's hands press into the track. 4 years of watching each other across finish lines and pretending that was all. 9 months in the same building, Thursdays at the same table. The November rain. She said the word love last night in a restaurant booth, and neither of them flinched. Now there are 8 lanes and a championship record and 7/100ths of a second between everything they built and everything they are about to become. The gun fires. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me tell you how 2 professional track and field athletes end up in a sports science lab at 9:15 on a Thursday night, with one of them pressing a notebook against her forehead like it is the only thing keeping her skull from splitting open. Let me tell you about Cassian Vale, who had been my rival before I knew her name and my problem ever since I did. Let me tell you about the specific kind of fury that lives at the intersection of respect and want. The kind you carry around for so long, it starts to feel like a part of your body, like a second skeleton. We had been competing against each other for 4 years before we ended up at the same national training center in April. 4 years of watching each other across infield warm-ups. 4 years of reading each other's splits in race reports. 4 years of the athletic world treating us as the 2 sides of the same argument about who was actually better. The argument had a clean answer most seasons, whoever crossed the finish line first, and the clean answer had swapped between us enough times that neither camp ever stopped arguing. I want to be clear about something that gets flattened in the way this story is usually told. Cassian was better than me for exactly 1 year. Her best year, her world championship year, the year she ran the fastest 400 meters ever recorded by a competitor in her age bracket. That year she was better, and I was not, and I went home from those championships and did not talk about it for 3 weeks, and then I went to work. I was better than her the year after, and the year after that. And then she had a development year with new coaching and was better than me again. And that was where the record stood when we found ourselves in the same national facility, assigned to the same morning training block, using equipment that had been divided between us with the diplomatic precision of a peace negotiation. The training center assigned us different coaches, naturally. Mine was Rosalind Hecht, a former European champion who coached the way architects build bridges, with extreme patience for the unsexy load-bearing elements. Cassian's was a man named Porter, who was brilliant in the way that made him difficult to work with, but consistently produced times that made the difficulty worth absorbing. What the training center had not accounted for, or perhaps had accounted for and decided was your problem to navigate, was that Cassian Vale and I would be in the same facility 6 days a week for 9 months, which is what a national training residency involves. 9 months of watching her warm up. 9 months of her watching me. 9 months of the particular intimacy that comes from 2 people who have been studying each other across competitive distances, suddenly being close enough to notice the specific way someone reaches for a water bottle, the sound a person makes when a rep goes wrong, the exact posture of a competitor processing a time that surprised her. That is a lot of information to accumulate about a person you are supposed to be indifferent to. I was not indifferent. I had never been indifferent. I had been competitive, which is different from indifferent in the same way that fire is different from air. In theory, a simple distinction. In practice, an argument with consequences. The notebook incident happened in month 3. I should explain the notebook. I kept one. Spiral-bound, dark green, the kind sold in bulk at office supply stores, for training notes. Splits, recovery data, annotations on race film, technical adjustments I wanted to raise with Rosalind. Not extraordinary. Most serious athletes keep something similar. What was extraordinary was the section at the back of the notebook that I had been keeping since year 2 of watching Cassian Vale compete. Not a journal, not personal. Technical observations. The way she ran the first curve, the rhythm change she made at 200 meters that no one else in our event had ever successfully duplicated. The adjustment she had made in her championship year that had accounted for the time differential I still could not fully explain through visible mechanics. It was, in other words, a record of the amount of attention I had been paying to Cassian Vale's body and its movement through space for 4 years. Which, taken out of its technical context and placed in a room where we were standing 6 inches apart at 9:15 on a Thursday night, had a meaning I was not yet willing to name. She had found it by accident. I had left the notebook on the equipment table while I went to the bathroom, and when I came back, she was holding it open to the back section, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded thing I had ever seen from her. She was not reading it like she was angry. She was reading it like she was being handled without permission. Like something she had been holding very carefully had been opened without her consent. Like the specific exposure of having your mechanics documented so precisely by someone who was supposed to be your opponent was a violation she did not have words for. She looked up when I came in. She said, "What is this?" I said, "My training notes." She said, "This is not training notes." I said, "Give that back." She held it up. "Give it back," I said. She looked at it. Then she threw it at me. Not hard enough to hurt, hard enough to say something. The something landed against my sternum, and then she bent down and picked the notebook up and pressed it to her forehead, and stood like that for long enough that I understood it was not a gesture. It was Cassian Vale containing herself. Using the pressure of a spiral-bound notebook against her skull to manage whatever was happening inside it. When she lowered it, her face had the composure back. Not all of it. Most of it. "You have been watching me for 4 years," she said. "That's what competitors do," I said. She looked at the notebook, then at me. "Not like this," she said. I held out my hand for it. She gave it back. Our fingers did not touch. We were, in the particular physics of that lab, too aware of each other to manage accidental contact. "I had a question for you," I said, "about the first curve. Your entry angle changed in the championship year, and I could not account for it from the outside." She looked at me. I said, "That is what the notes are about. I have been trying to understand the change." She said, "You could have asked me." I said, "You are my competitor." She said, "I am also here." We stood in that lab for another 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then she said, "The entry angle change was Rosalind's. She worked with Porter on it. Cross-consultation." I stared at her. "Rosalind," she said again, "your coach. She worked with my coach 2 seasons ago. My coach had worked with her coach. My coach had helped produce the adjustment I had been trying to reverse engineer for 2 years. I was going to have a conversation with Rosalind that was going to be brisk and direct, and Rosalind was going to be completely unrepentant about it." "You could have just asked," Cassian said. "You could have told me," I said. "I didn't know you were watching that closely," she said. The sentence sat in the room. "I didn't know you were watching that closely." She turned and left the lab. The door closed. I stood with my notebook and the specific sting in my chest that was not entirely from the spiral spine, and thought about 4 years of watching Cassian Vale and what it meant that she had not known how closely. Rosalind was, in fact, unrepentant. I raised it the next morning at 6:15, before the rest of the training block arrived, in her small office that smelled permanently of liniment and coffee. She listened to me describe the cross-consultation without interrupting, which was how I knew she had been expecting it. "It was 2 seasons ago," she said. "The collaboration was brief and specific. She needed the entry angle work, and I had the research. You worked with her coach," I said. "You helped produce the adjustment I have been analyzing for 2 years." Rosalind looked at me with the calm patience of a former champion who has coached enough competitive athletes to understand that the fury they feel about being outsmarted is usually about something else entirely. "Did the analysis help your training?" she asked. I said, "That is not the point." She said, "Then what is the point?" I did not have a clean answer. The point was the notebook. The point was Cassian's face when she found the back section. The point was not the cross-consultation at all, I realized, standing in Rosalind's office. The point was the 4 years of closely watching, and the lab, and the 6 inches, and the notebook against her forehead. The point was something I was not ready to hand to Rosalind over liniment and morning coffee. I said, "I would have liked to know, as a professional courtesy." Rosalind said, "I will note that for future collaborations." She said it with exactly the tone of a woman who had noted nothing and would continue to note nothing and was watching me figure out what I was actually upset about with the unhurried interest of someone who had seen this specific confusion before. I went to the track. Cassian was already there. This was not unusual. She was one of the first athletes to the facility most mornings, which I knew because I was one of the first athletes to the facility most mornings, and the particular arithmetic of that was something I had also noted without examining. She was in lane 4, working through start mechanics with a timing gate. She looked up when I came onto the track. She looked back at the timing gate. I went to lane 6. We ran starts in parallel for 20 minutes without speaking, which was the professional version of what had happened in the lab, proximity and the agreement not to name it. At the water station, she said, without looking at me directly, "The angle change is about hip flexor preload at the apex, not the stride pattern. Most people looked at the stride." I said nothing for a moment. I said, "How long do you have to preload before the approach?" She said, "Depends on the surface temperature." I said, "You keep a log for that?" She said, "You keep a notebook." And then she walked back to lane 4 and ran a start that was so precisely executed that the timing gate beeped a number I was not going to acknowledge out loud because I was a competitive athlete with professional dignity. This is what I want you to understand about Cassian Vale and me in those first 3 months. We were performing a rivalry that had become, somewhere in 4 years and 9 months of proximity, something considerably more complicated. The performance was good. We were both excellent at the performance. But the notebook had broken something open in the lab the night before, some seal on the understanding that this was only competition, and whatever was on the other side of the seal was not something either of us was equipped to manage cleanly. The next 6 weeks were the most productive of my training cycle, and the most personally expensive. Productive because Rosalind, apparently galvanized by the cross-consultation conversation, began introducing technical refinements that she had been reserving for the right moment, and the right moment had apparently arrived. My start mechanics improved measurably. My curve management became something I was no longer thinking about because I had internalized it enough to stop managing it consciously, which is the athlete's version of fluency. Expensive because Cassian Vale existed 6 lanes away from me 5 days a week, and I had stopped being able to explain the awareness as competitive. I noticed the things you notice about someone when you are no longer successfully framing them as an opponent. The way she stretched her left shoulder between sets, always the left, always with her right hand pulling gently at the rotator cuff in the specific motion of an old injury managed rather than healed. The way she talked to Porter, not deferentially, but not argumentatively either. The exact register of a person who respected someone's expertise without being made smaller by it. The way she ate lunch alone most days, at the far table in the facility cafeteria, with headphones in and a book open. Not because she was unfriendly, but because she needed the hour to be quiet, which I understood precisely because I needed the same thing and did it in a different room. We were, I was beginning to understand. The same kind of person, in ways that the competitive framing had made invisible. The specific intensity we each brought to the work. The preference for technical precision over motivational noise. The way we both went still when we were angry, which I knew because I had watched her be corrected by Porter on a technical point she disagreed with, and she had gone completely still and absorbed it, and come back the next day with data that supported her position, which she presented flatly and without any performance of vindication. I had done the same thing to Rosalind twice in the first month. Rosalind had told me with characteristic economy that I reminded her of someone difficult she used to coach, which I chose to take as a compliment. The first time we had dinner together was not planned. I was at the facility cafeteria on a Thursday at 7 in the evening, later than usual because Rosalind had kept me after the training block for a review of curve entry footage that ran longer than expected. The cafeteria was nearly empty. Cassian was at the far table, headphones in, book open, a plate of food she had not started. I took a table on the opposite side. She looked up when I came in. She looked back at her book. 15 minutes later, she was standing at my table with her tray. She said, "The far table is under a vent. It was making noise." I said, "This table is fine." She sat down. We ate in the specific silence of two people who have agreed to be in the same space without talking about why. And it was comfortable in a way that had no business being comfortable, given the lab and the notebook and the 6 weeks of deliberate non-engagement. Comfortable the way it is comfortable to be in the same room as someone whose rhythm matches yours, where you can be quiet without the quiet being a problem. She said, "How's the preload work going?" I said, 300ths better on the timing gate this week." She said, "Rosalind is good." I said, "Porter is not bad either." She said, "Porter is actually quite good. He's just confident in a way that reads as difficult until you understand that the confidence is earned." I said, "Rosalind is confident in a way that reads as indifferent." She said, "Is it indifferent?" I thought about the liniment and coffee office, about the cross-consultation she had not mentioned, about the particular patience of a woman who had watched me try to figure out what I was actually upset about, and had not helped, and had also not needed to. "No," I said, "it's not indifferent." Cassian looked at me. In the cafeteria light, with the evening quiet around us, she looked like the version of herself that existed when she was not performing anything. The version I had been accumulating information about for 9 months and 4 years before that. She said, "You've been watching me since year 2. I said, "You said that already." She said, "I'm saying it again because I want to know if you're going to explain it differently the second time." I looked at my food. I said, "The adjustment was a legitimate technical question." She said, "I know it was. I also know that most athletes who want to understand a competitor's mechanics watch film." I said, "I watch film." She said, "You also kept a separate section of a notebook." I said, "It's more granular than film." She said, "It's more personal than film." The words sat on the table between us. I said, "It was not intended to be personal." She looked at me with an expression that was not unkind and not combative, and was the closest thing to genuinely puzzled I had ever seen from her. She said, "What was it intended to be?" I said, "Thorough." She said, "Okay." She ate, I ate. The cafeteria vent hummed somewhere. She said, "I've been watching you too." I looked up. She said, "I don't keep a notebook. I keep the information in my head, which is different in form and not in substance." I said, "What kind of information?" She said, "The kind that tells me what you're going to do before you do it, in a race. The kind that tells me when you've had a bad sleep from how you approach the warm-up. The kind that tells me when something is bothering you because you go 1% slower on the technical reps and 1% faster on the power reps, and the ratio is opposite from your good days." I stared at her. She said, "I am not less thorough than you. I am differently organized." I said, "Why are you telling me this?" She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Because you have been treating the notebook like a secret. And I don't think secrets between people who are paying this much attention to each other are useful." The cafeteria was very quiet. I said, "We're competitors." She said, "We're also here." It was the same thing she had said in the lab. I recognized it as a pattern. Cassian Vale saying the simplest possible true thing and waiting to see what I did with it. She had the patience of someone who had learned that the simple true thing did not need to be elaborated upon if you were willing to let it sit. I was not, historically, a person comfortable letting things sit. I said, "What do you want to do about it?" She said, "About what, specifically?" I said, "The information we've both been accumulating." She said, "I want to keep accumulating it." I said, "That's not an answer." She said, "It is, actually." She picked up her tray and stood. She said, "Good night, Raina." I said, "Good night." She left. I sat at the cafeteria table for another 10 minutes and thought about the ratio of my technical to power reps on good days versus bad days, and what it meant that she had measured it closely enough to reverse engineer my sleep quality from the data. The second month in was when the training center coordinator assigned us to the same sports science appointment. This was administrative, not deliberate. The lab slots were limited. Rosalind and Porter had apparently communicated about the efficiency of coordinating certain assessments. We arrived at the same time, separately, and both stopped in the hallway outside the lab door when we realized. The sports scientist was a young woman named Bex, who had the clear eyes of someone who had been working with professional athletes long enough to develop an immunity to their various social dynamics. She looked at us in the hallway and said, "There's room for both. Come in." The assessment was a VO2 max protocol on parallel treadmills, in theory parallel, in the configuration of the lab, essentially adjacent. We ran at different grade intensities because our event-specific demands were not identical, but we were close enough that I could hear Cassian's breathing change at the elevation point where the demand increased. Close enough to track the pattern of her exertion and understand that she was at approximately 86% capacity, which was where I was also running, which was information I filed with the rest of it. After the treadmill protocol, there was a recovery assessment. We were sitting on adjacent benches with our heart rate monitor still attached, Bex moving between us making notes, and Cassian said, without preamble, "Your recovery rate is faster than I expected." I said, "Expected from what?" She said, "From watching your races. You look like you spend more in the last 40 meters than you do." I said, "I spend more in the first 200. She said, "I know. You look like you don't, and that's useful." I said, "Are you telling me how my race looks from the outside?" She said, "I'm correcting your assumption that I was only watching the finish line." Bex, to her considerable credit, said nothing and looked at her tablet. I said, "What else did you notice?" Cassian said, "Your shoulder alignment at the set position has been different this month than it was in your last race. Rosalind made a change." I said, "You could see the shoulder alignment from the stands?" She said, "I that in lane 2. I could see your lane from my warm-up position." I said, "You were watching my set position during your own warm-up?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you were interesting." Bex turned a page. Cassian said, "You are technically the most interesting competitor I have in my event. You have been since your second season, when you made the adjustment that changed your curve mechanics and nobody else in the event caught up to it for a year and a half." I stared at her. She said, "It was not the same as the notebook, it was just watching." I said, "It is exactly the same as the notebook." She considered this. Then she said, "Yes, it probably is." We left the lab at the same time. In the hallway she stopped. She said, Have you figured out what the notebook is about yet? I said, the notebook is about technical analysis. She said, okay. She walked toward the changing rooms. Over her shoulder, not turning around, she said, when you figure out the rest of it, tell me. The rest of it took me 3 more weeks. I want to be accurate about what that process looked like because it was not romantic or dramatic or particularly graceful. It looked like me running intervals at 6 in the morning while mentally cataloging every interaction I'd had with Cassian Vale since April, and performing a very reluctant audit of what the catalog meant. It looked like a conversation with Rosalind in which I did not mention Cassian's name, but described a situation in general enough terms that Rosalind looked at me over her coffee for a long moment and said, "The thing you are describing is attraction, Raina, which is a normal human experience." I said, "I didn't ask for a diagnosis." Rosalind said, "You described a situation in enough detail for one. What would you like me to do with it?" I said, "Tell me how to manage it." Rosalind said, "The same way you manage everything, with precision and appropriate investment." She paused. The appropriate investment being the honest part, which is what you are currently avoiding. I said, "She is my competitor." Rosalind said, "She is also here, which you appear to be finding more relevant." I looked at her. She said, "That is not my phrasing." I went back to the track. It was Cassian's analysis of my race mechanics that I kept returning to. Not as evidence of attraction, I was very committed to not using that word yet, but as evidence of the specific quality of attention she had been paying to me. She had been watching my shoulder alignment during her own warm-up. She had been reverse engineering my sleep quality from training ratios. She had kept the information in her head for 4 years and delivered it across a cafeteria table as simply as a split time. She had been keeping a notebook too, just differently organized. The understanding of what that meant arrived on a Tuesday at the end of a tempo set, standing at the side of the track with my hands on my knees and the morning light doing something flat and clear across the infield. Cassian was at the timing gate in lane 4. She was writing something in the small, waterproof notebook she carried to track sessions. She looked up and found me looking at her. She did not look away first. I straightened up and walked to the water station and drank a full bottle without tasting it and thought, this is what it is. Not competition, not rivalry. The competition is real and the rivalry is real, and those things are not the problem. The problem, the word I had been avoiding, is that I have been in love with Cassian Vale in the specific way that looks like obsessive technical interest until you are forced to audit it at 6 in the morning while running intervals, and you realize there is no technical justification for knowing how she reaches for a water bottle. I did not go tell her immediately. I went and ran 4 more reps and had a technical session with Rosalind and ate lunch alone and processed it in the way I process all significant information, which is slowly and with full attention and a reluctance to name it before I am certain of what I am naming. By evening, I was certain. She was in the facility weight room at 6, which I knew because I was in the facility weight room at 6, which she probably also knew. We were on opposite sides of the room. I finished my session before she did, which was unusual. She typically trained shorter in the weight room than I did because her event priorities were different. I sat on a bench with a water bottle and waited for her to finish. She came over when she was done. She looked at me sitting on the bench and she said, "You're waiting." I said, "Yes." She looked at the water bottle, then at me. She said, "Did you figure out the rest of it?" I said, "Yes." She sat on the bench beside me, not close enough to touch, close enough to be deliberate. She said, "And?" I said, "The notebook is personal. You were right." She said nothing for a moment. I said, "I have been paying more attention to you than technical analysis accounts for. I have known that since the lab. I have been deciding what to do about it." She said, "What have you decided?" I said, "That honesty is probably the only useful approach." She said, "Probably?" I said, "Definitely." She looked at the weight room, the equipment, the mirrors, the exit sign, anywhere that was not my face, which told me she was processing something she was not ready to deliver without preparation. She said, "We are competitors." I said, "I know." She said, "And this facility is our professional environment for the next 6 months." I said, "I know." She said, "And whatever this is," she stopped. I said, "Say the whole sentence." She said, "Whatever this is, it is not something that disappears if we name it." I said, "No, it doesn't." She looked at me then, really looked with the full attention she brought to race film and training data and everything she decided was worth understanding completely. She said, "I've been watching you since year 2 as well." I said, "You told me that." She said, "I'm telling you why." The weight room was very quiet. The ventilation hummed, the mirrors gave us back to ourselves at a slight angle. She said, "Because you were the most interesting problem I had in my career, and the most interesting person I had in my sightline, and I did not examine the distinction carefully enough, early enough, to know when it had changed." I said, "When did it change?" She said, "Slowly, all at once. I don't know the exact moment. I know that by the time I found your notebook, I was not reading it like a competitor reading another competitor's data." I said, "What were you reading it like?" She said, "Like someone who had just found the evidence that the feeling was not one-sided." The bench between us held its distance. Neither of us moved. I said, "It's not one-sided." She said, "I know that now." I said, "What do you want to do about it?" She said, "I want to be very careful because we have 6 months in this facility and a championship season after that, and I am not willing to let this cost either of us what we've built." I said, "Agreed." She said, "And I want to be honest, because I have been accumulating information about you for 4 years and performing a much simpler relationship with that information than it actually was, and I am not interested in continuing to perform." I said, "Agreed." She said, "So we are honest and we are careful." I said, "Yes." A pause. She said, "That is probably not how this is usually done." I said, "We're not usually people." She looked at me, and then, for the first time in 4 years and 9 months of Cassian Vale existing in my competitive world, she smiled. Not the contained, professional expression that passed for warmth in press zones. Something real, and slightly surprised at itself. She said, "No, we are not." She stood. She picked up her water bottle. She said, "I'm going to take tonight to think about it." I said, "I'll be here tomorrow." She said, "I know." She walked out of the weight room. I sat on the bench for a while longer and looked at the exit sign and thought about 4 years of watching her cross finish lines and the notebook in the back of the green spiral bound and the specific satisfaction of a problem finally named. The next 3 weeks had the particular texture of 2 people who have said a true thing and are now navigating what it costs in the context they are already in. We were still competitors. We were still in the same facility. We were still accountable to our coaches and our programs and the professional environment that had no particular protocol for what we were building. What we were building was careful. She had said careful, and she had meant it. Cassian Vale, in every version I had observed, meant what she said, which was one of the things that made her the problem she was. We ran the morning block in our separate lanes. We had cafeteria dinners on Thursdays, which became a pattern without either of us naming it as such. We talked about mechanics and training theory and the specific qualities of various competition surfaces, and then, gradually, other things. Her family in Montreal, the city she had grown up running in because a winter in Montreal produced either a runner or a philosopher, and she had become both. My first serious coach, the one before Rosalind, who had seen something in my mechanics that no one else had, and had been wrong about everything else. We were learning each other the way you learn someone when the professional frame is present but no longer sufficient. Slowly, with the specific patience of people who understood that the thing they were handling was worth handling correctly. Rosalind said nothing explicit. She did say, at the end of a particularly productive technical session, that my start mechanics were the cleanest she had seen them, and asked if there had been any change in my preparation. I said, "Sleep has been better." Rosalind said, "Good." She said it with the particular dryness of a woman who had noticed something and was choosing not to discuss it, which was its own form of generosity. Porter, Cassian told me later, had said something similar. What he had actually said, according to Cassian, was, "Your focus has a different quality lately," which was either the most precise observation or the most imprecise one, depending on what he had meant by quality. The incident with the coordination panel happened 6 weeks in. The training center had a bi-monthly coordination panel where the coaching staff reviewed athlete progress and flagged any concerns, standard practice. Cassian and I were reviewed in the same session, separately, but the panel met in a room where sound traveled through the wall to the adjacent waiting area in ways that the facility had presumably not accounted for. I was waiting for my review when I heard Porter say, "Her intensity has increased in the last month." There is a focus adjustment I want to understand before I attribute it entirely to positive training variables. And then a voice I did not recognize said, "The intensity adjustment, is it competition-focused, or is there another variable?" And Porter said, "I'm not certain. I'm watching it." I sat in the waiting room and thought about what it meant that Porter was watching it. Porter was observant in the way that specific coaches are observant, not broadly, but deeply within their area of expertise, which was athletic performance and the variables that affected it. If he was watching the intensity adjustment, he had noticed the source and was deciding what to do about the noticing. Cassian met me in the hallway after her review. She said, "Porter mentioned my focus adjustment." I said, "I heard." She said, "Through the wall?" I said, "Through the wall." She looked at the wall, then at me. She said, "He's going to ask me directly eventually." I said, "What will you say?" She said, "The truth, with appropriate framing." I said, "What's the appropriate framing?" She said, "That I am managing a personal situation that is not affecting my performance metrics, which is accurate." I said, "He'll know there's more." She said, "He'll probably know there's more. He'll also know that I am being honest about the part that affects his work, which is the part he's entitled to." I looked at her. This woman who moved through complicated situations with the same precision she brought to race mechanics, not rigidly, but thoughtfully, accounting for the variables she could control and disclosing the ones she couldn't without making them larger than they were. I said, "You've thought about this." She said, "I think about everything." I said, "I know." She said, "I know you know." The hallway between us felt very small. She said, "I am going to tell Porter before he asks. It is more honest." I said, "Are you telling me you're going to tell Porter?" She said, "I'm asking if you object." I said, "I don't object." She said, "Then I'll tell him tomorrow." She told Porter the next day. I know because she told me that she had, and because Porter came to a joint equipment session the following afternoon with the expression of a man who had received information he had already mostly inferred and was deciding how to process it professionally. He said nothing to me directly. He said nothing to Rosalind as far as I knew. He simply made a note somewhere in his internal architecture and continued coaching Cassian with the same intensity he always brought to it. Rosalind said, "At the end of my next session, I think it is time we discuss the cross-consultation." I sat down. She said, "The adjustment I shared with Porter 2 seasons ago, I should have told you at the time. I made a judgment that the information would serve both athletes, and that you were both sophisticated enough to eventually find each other's work. I was right about the second part. I was less correct about the discretion of the first part. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because you would have used it as a reason to study her mechanics more carefully, and I was not certain at that point that studying her mechanics more carefully was entirely about the competition." I stared at her. Rosalind said, "I have been watching you for 2 years, Raina. The notebook section you described is not a recent development." I said, "You knew about the notebook section?" She said, "I inferred it. You are not as opaque as you believe." I sat with that. She said, "Is it manageable?" I said, "I think so. We're being careful." She said, "Being careful is correct. Being honest is also correct. You appear to be doing both." She said, "Your mechanics are the best they've been. Whatever is happening in the rest of your life, it is not hurting your work." I said, "It's helping." She said, "I know. That's why I'm not saying anything else about it." She picked up her clipboard. She said, "Entry curve, tomorrow. I want to work the preload in live conditions." I said, "With Cassian?" She looked at me. She said, "With Cassian. The first time we ran a shared technical session, it had been inadvertent. This time it was deliberate, coordinated, between Rosalind and Porter over what was apparently a productive professional conversation, because Rosalind and Porter had apparently been having productive professional conversations for 2 seasons, and I was only now aware of the extent of it. Cassian arrived at the track at the same time I did, which told me she had been given the same timeline, which told me our coaches had coordinated, which was information we both processed in the same moment with the same expression. She said, "Porter mentioned a joint session." I said, "Rosalind said the same." She said, "They did not ask us." I said, "No." She said, "Rosalind is confident." I said, "That's one word for it." We ran. What happened when Cassian Vale and I ran shared technical reps on the same track with our coaches on opposite sides of the infield watching was something I did not have precise language for. The competitive awareness was still there. It never went away. It was the longest-standing thing between us. But it existed alongside the other thing. The careful, honest thing we had been building. And the two did not cancel each other out. They were different frequencies. They could both be true. Rosalind said, at the break, "The preload is cleaner when she's in the adjacent lane." I said, "I'm not looking at her." Rosalind said, "You don't have to look at her. You're aware of her. The awareness is calibrating your timing." I looked at the track. Cassian was at the water station with Porter, listening to something he was saying with the particular attention she brought to technical corrections. Rosalind said, "This is not a problem." I said, "I know." She said, "It's actually interesting." 2 athletes whose competitive dynamic has become a calibrating variable for each other's performance. I've read about this. I've never seen it. I said, "You could write a paper." She said, "I am already taking notes." I said, "Of course you are." She almost smiled. Almost. She said, "Porter is also taking notes." I said, "We're being documented." She said, "You are being coached. The documentation is a byproduct." I went back to the lane. Cassian came back from the water station. We set up at our marks, and Porter counted us down, and we ran the rep, and the timing gate beeped at the end, and both our numbers were clean. In the silence after, Cassian said, "That was a good rep." I said, "Yes." She said, "The calibration thing." I said, "Rosalind mentioned it." She said, "Porter said something similar. He called it competitive resonance." I said, "He gave it a name." She said, "Porter names everything. It's how he processes it." I said, "What did you say when he named it?" She said, "I said it felt accurate." We looked at each other across the 6 feet of track between our lanes. She said, "Does it feel accurate to you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She went back to her mark, I went back to mine. We ran the next rep and it was 1/100th cleaner than the last, and neither of us said anything about it, and we didn't have to. The thing about competitive resonance, as Porter had apparently named it, was that it worked in both directions. When Cassian ran well, I ran better. When I made a technical adjustment that improved my splits, she made a corresponding adjustment that I had not anticipated. We were pulling each other's performance upward in ways that our coaches were documenting with the focused attention of people watching something unusual happen. What our coaches were less explicitly discussing was the other direction the resonance ran. The one that had nothing to do with splits and everything to do with the specific quality of paying attention to someone whose rhythm matched yours. The rain happened in the 7th week, not unusual for the time of year. The facility had covered track access, but the outdoor infield was an open program, and when the afternoon session ran long and the rain came early, we were caught on the outdoor track with equipment that needed to be moved and a canopy that needed to be secured, and Porter and Rosalind already under cover with the rest of the coaching staff, managing the more vulnerable equipment. Cassian and I were at the far end of the infield with a timing gate that needed to be broken down and 2 kit bags between us, and rain that was moving from light to serious in the way it does when it decides. We worked fast. The breakdown was the kind of task that takes 2 people and a clear division of labor, and neither of us needed to say anything to figure out who was doing which part. She held the gate structure, I handled the brackets. I took the heavier kit bag, she took the electronics case. We made it to the covered area before the rain became a problem. We stood under the awning with our hair wet and our training gear dark with rain, and the equipment safely shelved, and the track behind us going from gray to shining in the afternoon downpour. She said, "That was efficient." I said, "We've worked out the division of labor." She said, 4 years of competition does that." I said, "Also 6 months of facility proximity." She said, "Also that." We stood under the awning. The rain was loud. Everyone else had moved inside. We had not moved inside. She turned to look at me. With wet hair and no professional frame around her, and rain making the infield shine behind her, she looked very much like a person, and not at all like the version of herself that had been my competitor for 4 years. She looked like someone I had been paying careful, honest, accumulating attention to for longer than I had admitted, and was now standing close enough to understand what all that attention had been building toward. She said, "Are we still being careful?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She did not move. I said, "Cassian." She said, "What?" I said, "I'm going to say something true." She said, "Okay." I said, "I have been in love with you since at least the 2nd year. I am certain of this in the way I am certain of technical things, which means I have tested the conclusion against the available evidence, and I cannot produce an alternative explanation that accounts for the data." She looked at me for a long moment. The rain came down on the infield. She said, "That is the most methodical declaration I have ever received." I said, "I worked with what I had." She said, "You had a notebook." I said, "I had a notebook." She looked at the rain, then at me. She said, "I have been in love with you since the 3rd year, when you made the curve adjustment that nobody else in the event caught up to for a year and a half. I did not examine the data as carefully as you did. I arrived at the same conclusion." I said, "A year later than me." She said, "I was distracted by your splits." I said, "That's the most athletic thing anyone has said to me in a romantic context." She said, "We are athletic people." We were standing very close, not touching, close enough that not touching was its own kind of presence. She said, "We're still in the facility." I said, "I know." She said, "And the season is still—" I said, I know. She said, so we are still being careful. I said, yes, but I wanted you to know. She said, I know. She said, I also want you to know. I said, I know. We stood like that, under the awning in the rain, with everything named, and the careful still in place, and the distance still in place, and neither of us moving to close it because closing it here, in this facility, in this rain, was not the right moment, and we were both precise enough people to know what the right moment required. She said, after the season. I said, after the season. She said, the championship. I said, the championship. She looked at me. Something in her face was fully open. Not the technical focus, not the competitive composure, just Cassian Vale with her hair wet from the rain being honest without a frame around it. She said, that gives us something to run toward that is not each other. I said, we've always had that. She said, this is different. I said, I know. I said, run fast. She said, you run fast. The rain slowed. The rest of the coaching staff came back to the covered area, professional noise resuming around us, the facility returning to itself. We moved apart to our natural distances. We picked up our equipment. We went through the rest of the afternoon with the professional efficiency that had always been our baseline. But the thing had been said. The notebook had a full account now, one that lived inside two people instead of on green spiral-bound paper, and it was the most complete technical record I had ever kept. Rosalind caught me on the way out. She said, good rain response. I said, the equipment is secure. She said, that's not what I meant. She said, good night, Raina. I said, good night. I walked out into the evening, which was still wet, and thought about the championship 4 months away, and what it meant to have something to run toward that was not each other. I thought about it being worth waiting for. I thought about it being worth running fast. The 4 months between the rain and the championship were the most precisely calibrated period of my athletic career. Not because Cassian and I had become careful in the way that involves distance. We had become careful in the way that involves full honesty about the situation and a shared agreement about what it required. The distinction matters. Distance looks like avoidance. What we were doing looked like two people who had named a thing and decided, together, that the named thing could wait because both of them understood what was at stake and neither of them was willing to compromise it. The training center noticed, as training centers do, not the truth of it, the professional surface of it, which was that two athletes who had been managing a careful rivalry were now managing something else with the same careful precision. Rosalind noticed because Rosalind noticed everything and had the grace not to discuss it beyond what was useful. Porter noticed because Porter had named it competitive resonance and was watching its effects on Cassian's splits with the focused interest of a scientist watching a controlled variable produce unexpected data. What the data said was that we were both running faster. Not because of each other specifically, or not only because of each other. The technical work was real. The adjustments Rosalind had introduced in the 3rd month were settling into my mechanics in the way that good technical work settles, not as a conscious thought but as a body knowledge, a change you have internalized enough to stop managing and start using. My curve entry was the cleanest it had been in 3 seasons. My start mechanics were, according to the timing gate, in the top 5% of what I had ever recorded. Cassian's times were similarly accelerating. Porter attributed it to the integration of the hip flexor preload work. Cassian attributed it, in her economical way, to having fewer unresolved problems taking up processing space. She said this to me on a Thursday at the cafeteria table, and I looked at her, and she looked at her food, and neither of us said anything else about it, but I thought about it for 3 days. The resolved problem, the named thing, had done something unexpected to the competitive dynamic between us. We had expected it to complicate it. What it had done instead was clarify it. On the track, across the infield, in the timing gate data, the competition was cleaner than it had been since year 1. not diminished, clarified. Like a signal that had been carrying interference for 4 years and had finally been tuned. I said this to Rosalind at the end of November. She said, "You are surprised by this." I said, "I expected it to be more complicated." She said, "Naming a thing removes its static. The static was the complication." I said, "That is the simplest possible explanation." She said, "The simplest explanations are usually the right ones." She paused. "That does not mean the situation is simple." It was not simple. It was careful and honest and conducted within the professional environment, with the discipline that both of us had brought to everything we cared about. The cafeteria dinners continued on Thursdays. We ran joint technical sessions twice a week. We talked, more now, about things outside of athletics. Her family's move from Montreal when she was 14. The adjustment of becoming an athlete in a country where her event was treated as a secondary concern behind team sports. The specific stubbornness required to build a career in that environment. My first serious coach. The year I came second in the national championships and did not speak to anyone for a week, and then came back and ran the fastest time of my career at the following invitational, out of pure fury. She said about the fury, "That is the most Raina thing I have ever heard." I said, "You have known me for 9 months." She said, "I have been watching you for 4 years. The 9 months is the part where I was close enough to confirm what I already suspected." I said, "What did you already suspect?" She said that you are made of more stubbornness than anything else. That the stubbornness is what makes the precision work. That without the stubbornness, the precision would be correctness, which is not the same thing. I sat with that. Rosalind had told me something similar in different language, but hearing it from Cassian was different. It was the difference between being observed by a coach and being understood by someone who had been doing the same work in the same conditions for the same amount of time, and had therefore developed an informed opinion rather than a professional assessment. I said, "What does stubbornness look like from the outside when you're watching across a finish line?" She said, "Like absolute refusal. Like the second 200 of every race you have run, where you should, theoretically, be losing speed, and instead you appear to make a decision." I said, "I do make a decision." She said, "I know. I could see it from lane 2. It was the thing I watched most closely." I said, "More closely than the splits?" She said, "The splits are the result of the decision. I wanted to understand the decision." We were in the cafeteria, Thursday, November, rain on the windows. The table between us had the particular neutrality of a space that had become familiar. She was eating with the same economy she brought to everything. I was watching her, and she knew I was watching her, and neither of us was performing anything. I said, "Have you understood it?" She said, "Mostly. There is still one variable I haven't accounted for." I said, "What variable?" She looked at me. In the cafeteria light, with rain on the windows, her face did the thing it did when she was being fully honest without preparation. She said, "Whether the decision feels the same to you from inside as it looks from outside." I said, "How does it look from outside?" She said, "Like certainty. Like a woman who has decided she is going to finish and there is no question about the finishing." I said, "That's what it feels like from inside." She said, "Good." She said it quietly, with the satisfaction of someone who had tested a hypothesis and confirmed it. Good. Like the data point had closed a loop she had been running open for a long time. I said, "Cassian." She said, "What?" I said, "After the championship." She looked at me. I said, "I want you to know that I am not operating on patience. I'm operating on the understanding that some things are worth arriving at correctly, that the arriving matters as much as the thing you arrive at." She held my gaze across the cafeteria table. She said, "That is the most you have ever said in one speech." I said. I've been thinking about how to say it for 3 weeks. She said, I know. I could tell from the training ratios. I laughed. Short, real, the kind that catches you off guard. She watched me laugh with an expression that was not her competitive face, or her technical face, or any of the professional versions I had accumulated over 4 years. It was something quieter and more specific, and I filed it with everything else I had been accumulating. She said, I know what you mean about arriving correctly. I said, good. She said, after the championship. I said, after the championship. The regional qualifier was in January. We ran it in separate heats, which was standard for the qualifying round structure, which meant I watched Cassian's heat from the infield warm-up area, and she watched mine from the same position. She qualified first, I qualified second. The order meant nothing to the championship seeding. It meant something to neither of us that we filed privately. What the qualifier produced, apart from championship berths, was visibility. The athletics media had been tracking the narrative of our facility placement since October, running pieces about competitive calibration and the National Training Center's decision to house rivals together, and what it did to each of them. The narrative was correct about the track data, and entirely wrong about everything else, which was how good narratives usually worked. A journalist named Vera Kwan covered the qualifier for a national athletics publication. She was thorough, technically accurate about the race mechanics, and observant in the way that journalists who cover niche sports are observant, with a broader contextual awareness than specialists, but a narrower technical frame. She interviewed us separately after our heats. She interviewed us briefly together after the qualifier results were posted, which was the first time we had been formally in the same interview frame, and she noticed something in that 5 minutes that did not appear in the published piece, but that I suspected she had logged. She said, at the end of the joint segment, "You two have been at the same facility for 9 months. How has that changed the competitive dynamic?" Cassian said, "Technical exposure to a competitor at close range clarifies assumptions. You can watch someone on film for years and still be accounting for things that aren't there." Vera said, "And what did you find wasn't there?" Cassian said, "A limit I had assumed existed." Vera looked at her, then at me. I said, "The shared environment raised the standard for both of us. That's the purpose of a training center." Vera said, "Is that all it raised?" A pause, not long, professional. I said, "That's the relevant part for the athletics record." Vera looked between us again. She had the expression of a journalist who had found something more interesting than the assigned story and was deciding with professional integrity not to chase it in a public forum. She said, "Good luck at the championship." She left. Cassian and I stood on the qualifier infield with our kit bags and the championship credential lanyards we had just been issued, and did not say anything for a moment. Cassian said, "She noticed." I said, "Yes." Cassian said, "She won't write it." I said, "Good journalist." We drove to the championship city 3 hours south. Rosalind ran strategy for the first hour and let me have the second in silence. At the team hotel, she asked, "How's the preload?" I said, "Ready." She said, "And the rest of it?" I said, "After the race." She nodded once and said, "Good sequence." I won my first round heat. My semifinal was cleaner still. The curve entry exactly as Rosalind and I had worked it. The back straight, a controlled expenditure that left me arriving at the finish with something left. Cassian's semifinal was 30 minutes later. I watched from the warm-up area. She ran a personal best by 400ths, a margin that made the entire area go quiet the way the sports science lab had gone quiet the night this began. I stood there and felt something that was not competitive, something that was precisely and undeniably pride. The final was the following morning. 8 athletes. I drew lane 5. Cassian drew lane 4. Adjacent, separated by the lane line, close enough that in the set position, she was directly to my left. In the call room, she had her headphones in, eyes closed. She opened them and found me immediately, without looking around the room first. 1 second. The look said, "I know you're here. I know what comes after." The gun fires. She put her headphones back in. I put mine in. What I know from the outside. I won. She finished second. 7/100ths of a second. Both our times were personal bests. The championship record fell to my name. What I know from the inside. At 200 meters in the back straight, I made the decision she had been watching me make from lane 2 for 4 years. The absolute refusal. The certainty. She made the same decision. I couldn't see her, but I felt it. At the finish line, she held out her hand, palm up. I took it. 1 second. Her grip certain. Her hand warm. Neither of us pretending that 7/100ths was the whole story. We found a restaurant that had nothing on the walls about running. In a booth, across from each other, she set her glass down and said, "The notebook." I said, "You can have it." She said, "And what I said in the weight room, I want to say it again." Without the careful. I said, "Say it." She said, "I love you, since the 3rd year." The adjustment on your first curve. The decision in the back straight. The week you didn't speak to anyone after nationals and then came back and ran the fastest time of your career. All of it. Since then, I said I love you since the 2nd year. Since the mid-race adjustment, I had never seen anyone make at that speed. Since the first note in the green notebook that I told myself was professional interest. She reached across the table, hand open between us, an offering, not a claim. I set mine over hers. Her grip settled around it with the same certainty she brought to everything she decided to do. She said, "This is what correct feels like." I said, "Yes." Later, on the championship pavement, she reached up and touched my jaw, one hand, carefully. Not a claim, a question. I turned my face into her hand. She said, "I have been waiting to do this since the first rain, month 2. I decided then and I waited because we agreed to wait." I said, "This is the correct arrival." She said, "Yes." She kissed me the way she ran, deliberate, fully present, honest in the way that only things arrived at correctly can be honest. The restraint finally becoming something it was always pointing toward. At the press availability the next morning, Vera Kwan sat in the front row. At the end of the Q&A, she asked what happens between two athletes when they've watched each other closely enough and long enough to run like that together. Cassian said, "You stop accounting for things that aren't there." I said, "You compete with what's actually true." Vera said, "And what's actually true?" Cassian and I looked at each other across the adjacent tables, across 4 years, across 7/100ths of a second. I said, "The competition made both of us better, and the rest of it made us more honest." Rosalind walked past my chair on the way out and said quietly, "Good answer." Outside, Cassian stood beside me with the championship morning through the window, and the look on her face that was not any of the professional versions. Just Cassian Vale, present and chosen, having arrived at something correctly. She said, "There are still tomato problems to solve." I said, "I've been waiting 6 seasons for a second opinion." She said, "I'm thorough." I said, "I know. Walk with me." She said, "Where?" I said, "Anywhere that isn't this building." We walked out into the city, and the distance between everything we had been and everything we were now was exactly the length of 4 years of honest, meticulous, thoroughly documented attention, and it had been, in every sense, worth every step.